Good afternoon. My name is Dr. John S. Mattox. I am the co-founder, along with my lovely wife, who is now in heaven, of the Underground Railroad Museum, which is located at 121 High Street, Flushing, Ohio. And we are a nonprofit 501c3, and we are part of the National Park Service program and a member of many other organizations. But my wife and I founded this museum in 1984 in a small building when I was still employed with the Allstate Insurance Company as a senior account agent. And being that her mother, my adopted mother, and my wife were hoarders, never throwing away anything, we needed to develop a plan for people to buy our product. And when you're in a small community in Belmont County where people are not used to seeing a professional person that looks like me, you want to convince them that your product is as good as any other product. So we had to get them to come into the office. And by all of our people being hoarders, we collected items, put them on shelves. There's an old saying in the African American community that if you had a barber shop, you could stop by and get a haircut, get a meal, and even be assisted on the Underground Railroad. And along that with a coffee pot and those cameras on the top shelf, it would entice people to come in. All I needed was their social security number and tell them what I was selling. Made it very successful for my wife and I. So we created the nonprofit organization through our certification as a 501c3, along with a mission statement. And we are in need of more travelers because we want to leave this historical information to the next generation, which we'll call the 21st century. And if we can bring people in and give them a better understanding of other people's culture, we're going to be able to survive in this great country called the United States of America, because this is American history. This is not black history. It is part of what our country is made up from. And we share our knowledge in a respectful way so that people are receptive by telling their stories and giving this information to other individuals as they travel around this great country. Gallion County, along with 22 other states, were all connected to the Underground Railroad in what we call our 13 colonies. And there are many stories that are mystical and some stories that are true. And you really have to do your homework and research to put together something that is so important to the understanding of American history. Many individuals today in the 20th century will tell you they were born in Cincinnati, Detroit, Newark, New Jersey. But the next question is, where were their parents born? And more than likely, living here in this part of the Northwest Territory, they came from Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, South Carolina, Georgia. And so now we have to realize that when we designate ourselves as a culture, we have a long road to remember. So Gallion County is close to the Ohio River. And if you go upriver, you come in contact with the Monongahela and the Ohio River. These rivers run together in Pittsburgh called the Three Rivers. And that is the way transportation was to get to places like Gallion County. So therefore, we have to know that when you talk about these lovely people who reside here in this beautiful part of America, they came from someplace else, unless it was in the 1920s and 30s when their ancestors brought them here. So you have to go back farther than that, because some of the names of the small communities here in Gallion County, Polk's Patch and Adamsville, and hundreds of other communities that these local people can tell you where they were raised, were very important. Coming out of Marietta, and coming across from Chillicothe, places like Belpre. It all started because of transportation, and you were transported on those rivers, or you walked like the Native Americans. And the stories that have to be told has to start back with West Africa. Now, there are many people in this community that were born free. And what we have to realize is these Africans were our ancestors. And now you also have to realize is those people were pure. We are not pure here. And so you start back from the beginning. Now, I'm not going to give you a history lesson and go back to the Magna Carta, but I do want you to know that the Constitution, which was created after the Declaration of Independence, and then later on created the Bill of Rights, is very important in our travel to success. And we're not there yet. But the road has been bumpy. And so it is my job as a member of the Underground Railroad Museum to share as much about the whole area as just one local area. And I'll make it very simple. I know a lot about a lot of things and a little bit about the major things. I'm willing to learn too. And every time I give a presentation, I always ask for apologies first, and then I tell them how much I appreciate them sharing with me what they know, because I'm going to get down to the brass tacks. I'm not going to put yeast in my stories. So we won't go back to the Magna Carta, but we'll go back to Ghana. We'll go back to Togo, Sierra Leone, Kenya, Congo. And if you want to know something that's important that young people need to know, words that were used years ago mean different things today. And so verbiage is very important. And during my presentation, I will give a few examples. And I'm glad that this is a reunion and a celebration and not a picnic. And you may ask me later, why? And I always like to share with people that if you follow the WWW experience, people are always asking why, where, and what's it worth. So now these people that were transported out of the great country of West Africa, and many of those small communities had 7 or 8 different languages. They were pulled out of their home country, and they were captured by the Portuguese and the Dutch. They were put on slave vessels that were provided by the financiers of England, and they had goodies on those vessels. And there were over 10,000 vessels that came out of England going to Africa and picking up people. The story also has to be shared that those Portuguese and Dutch could not have just jumped off of those vessels and captured people. They needed assistance, and the assistance was the African kings and queens who helped capture their own people. And I share that in a respectful way Because if you've never had guns, and you've never had ammunition, and you've never had real good alcohol, then that's something new to you. And slavery was different then. It wasn't like control. Slaves were part of people's families. And just a little intersection here. When God blew life into Adam in the Garden of Eden, he didn't say anything about color. We were all created equal. And so now that they're on these vessels, they took all the goodies and moved them around in the belly of the ship, and they made shelves to put our people on so that they could transport as many as they possibly could. I have you know that England was very, very modernistic. They had insurance companies that would insure their cargo. So if they loaded up 800 and only 600 arrived, they were taken care of by these insurance companies. North Carolina Mutual Insurance Company, which is now Wascovia. And when you can give someone a return on their loss, that's what insurance companies do. And now you have to think about the words I just told you about that mean something different today. They're going to be in the belly of the ship for 90 days, and they're going to travel from their capture of the door that never opened again, Sierra Leone, to places like Haiti, Santo Domingo, and America. And they had to be put into slave pens so they could be seasoned. That's the difference in seasoning today and the word that you would use if you were to buy a second-hand car called detail. So you season those people. And when they would come out of the slave pens, they would have on their owners nice clothes. They would be stripped off because they had been seasoned by having their hair cut, their wounds covered with rust, their bodies shined with lard. And now they're specimens. And they are, if you've ever heard the term, more likely to be originals rather than someone that's mixed. And so when they were put on the auction block, you were likely to purchase someone of your need from wherever you came from, because in places like Charleston and Biloxi, Mississippi, and Wheeling, Virginia, slaves were sold. And then they would be transported to the owner's property, which could have been one of those 13 colonies. Now, someone from Sierra Leone, where they grew a lot of rice, didn't want someone who was an expert in growing tobacco. That would be from the people from Carolina. So that's how this system worked. And this is the bad part, where families were broken up. And these families were sometimes assisted, because at auction blocks where you had religious leaders standing in the audience, Presbyterians, Methodists, Quakers, they would put their finances together and purchase a whole family rather than to see them broken up. Didn't happen all the time, but those of us who are here today, it probably happened for us. And we want to thank them for taking advantage to purchase our ancestors and not let us get broken up. Now that's the first part of history. And they're going to be transported all over the United States. And what is important is we have been a part of this beautiful country since the 1400s, before Mr. Columbus sailed. But we were all indentured servants at that time. No money. You gave people who were given property from the King of England an opportunity to develop it. They couldn't control the people that ran this country, called Native Americans. And the African Americans who always wanted to use the term, go free, go free. And if you're able to get historical remnants of stories that were told years ago, I hope you remember the word Amistad. where Senku said, "Go free," because they were not slaves. They were captured and put into slavery. And those stories could go on, how they caused revolts and hid nails in their armpits so that the overseers would know how they got loose to be responsible for a revolt. But they had thumb screws to make someone tell them the truth. And now we land in places like Sierra Leone and say we're going to walk back. So on those slave ships, people would commit suicide, want to go back to where they came from. And those that were not able to because they kept them chained together. They didn't want them to be able to communicate. And our communication came in religious spirituals. We've always had a belief. And when you hear the word, old Canaan, they're talking about Canada. But those plantation owners thought they were just some blackies having a good time singing. See, that's how this life has been able to survive. And we use all of these things that we call codes and signals to communicate because we were not allowed to gather in a group and share our understanding, but we were allowed to sing, and that's where the communication came. Now, I hope I haven't overburdened you with tidbits because there's something to go after everything that I've said. And all I want to do is put a carrot out there so people will visit the Underground Railroad Museum, and then I will tell them more. Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota was part of the Northwest Territory, 1787. And when you think about the forming of this country, I want you to go as far south as Marietta, Ohio, which was directly across from what's called Parkersburg. Names like Worthington, the Palmers, and Culture, these are the founders and representatives of that part of the southern part of Ohio. Now, there's something that you need to know, and it's in the Constitution. Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3. It tells you that all of these colonies needed representation. And when messengers would go to these individuals out of these 13 colonies, because messengers had been sent to them to meet in Washington City, that would be Washington, D.C. It could have been at one time New York. It could also have been Philadelphia, because we're talking about a spread of over 259 years. And so when they would arrive, they realized that representation would go by the number of people that presided in your area. And it was always more African American people than there were Caucasian white people. Incidentally, I've never seen a white person in my life because I've never seen anyone that looks like a refrigerator. That's white. And that's where that word pure comes in from African. And so now that you have these people wanting to go free, sometimes certain religious organizations are held to a higher standard than others. But African people did not just stand by and be passive and wanted someone to help them. They took it upon themselves to walk off. And sometimes they would be one or two, but it would never be a whole group because they would be caught. And so now when they would land in places, there were songs and codes necessary to ask for help. Friend of a friend. Someone had told you 10 miles up the road you may get some assistance. Just because you crossed the Ohio River or got across the Monongahela did not mean you were safe, because you could be kidnapped and taken back. And they had individuals called bounty hunters or bird hunters. And these bird hunters were bounty hunters because they wanted to get the property back. And there were laws on the books. The most important one that we are recognized with today is the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, but there was one in 1793. So the law that came about after our 13th president, Millard Fillmore, in 1850 just put more teeth in the law. And just because we're in the state of Ohio, if you did stay in the state of Ohio, you had to have the blessings of a white person who put a bond on you that you were a respectful person and would not break the law. So that's something that a lot of people haven't read in the appeals that people have learned existed. And these stories are found in the letters sent to their husbands in the war, or church records, which people wrote what happened to them. And they came out in what's called narratives. And when you think about Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the middle 30s, he created what was called the WPA. And these narratives told stories that slaves were telling these interviewers. You get a different story from a white interviewer than you'd get from a black interviewer. And you have to develop an understanding of which one was true. And they're available today in all your libraries. The narratives of slave children, the narratives of slave men, the narratives of slave women, the narratives of every individual that they could contact to get their story about slavery. Now that these things have taken place in the 30s, I have something very important to share with you how this interest became so important. Back in 1990, there was a public law put on the books, 101628. And this was because the National Park Service wanted to know more about this historical history called the Underground Railroad. A very important mentor of mine, a fellow by the name of Dr. Charles Blockson, was the co-chair of a committee to create this system of understanding through the Department of Interior, working for the National Park Service, to tell these stories that we've been talking about. And so now you have a group of people who are members of the National Park Service, like myself, in a program telling stories that took place years before. And if we didn't have this, it's called the Network to Freedom, under the Department of Park Services, that was controlled by the Department of Interior under this committee. And so now, in the 1990s, everybody is interested in the story of the Underground Railroad. And you can Google this and find out all of these 700 safe houses located just in the state of Ohio. And then you go to Indiana and these other places that were free. Yesterday, here at this wonderful presentation of Emancipation Day, we had a replay of Abraham Lincoln talking to Frederick Douglass. Now, they couldn't get deeply into the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and the Emancipation. They didn't have time. That's why you need to come to the museum, where you can take your time and read these stories that the National Park Service has put out, so that everyone can learn about the little hamlets, the maroons that people lived in, coming out of Tennessee, coming out of South Carolina, coming out of Georgia. They didn't all want to go to Canaan. Some of them ended up in the dismal swamps of South Carolina and Georgia. These people are called Geechees. That's a dialect of African dialect and English dialect, and it's their own language, and only they understand it. And those people exist today. But what is important about our American history, our people have learned how to survive. They have taken what they were controlled, and they have earned a living by having museums and historical societies telling their own story. They even have reenactments today. And so when you see someone that looks like us on television, it's called survival skills. When you think about Red Fox and Grady scratching his head and shuffling his feet, laughing at jokes that weren't even funny, those are survival skills. And there are people who can go to a theater and give you an impression that this is what happened. And they're making money off of this, and they should. But in the Underground Railroad Museum, we do not sell our culture. We do not charge you a fee. but we try and give you such a professional presentation you'll be embarrassed not to leave something. That's when you accept this respectfully as your culture. And the more people that come in and learn about Tennessee and learn about the Dismal Swamp, learn about Sojourner Truth up in New York, learn about Harriet Tubman out of Maryland, Frederick Douglass out of Maryland, but never forget there are people who are people of color who helped develop the state that we now call D.C. The Columbus area was invented by Benjamin Bonneke. The ironing board by other famous people. The term, the real McCoy, Elijah McCoy out of Illinois. The red light, all of these things our young people need to know they can do anything they want. This is one of the great answers of the future. See, people have to realize conversation is necessary to get compromise. And first of all, the most important thing is education. And education is the key as long as they don't change the locks. And I say that because if you can read, and then check the footnotes, you're going to find out that there's a lot of things that you did not know. The Native Americans, the Africans who came from West Africa, they had griots, people who told stories. And that's why I'm glad to see this Emancipation Day take on the awe of what it used to be, where older individuals would sit down and communicate what it used to be like. That's telling young people what they had to go through. They did it in the Native American culture, and they did it in the African American culture years ago, under the oak tree, next to the church where your buried relatives are. That's how these celebrations used to take place. But we know we're moving into a 21st century, and it's technical. I mean, we started with the Ice Age, then we have the agricultural age, and then we have the technology age, which we're in now. Now we need the humanitarian age, where people will come together and be able to communicate to come up with what is called compromise. You're never going to get anywhere fighting each other. Now here's something that's important. The word racism is thrown around like a basketball. There are as many, and not as many as you want it to be, racist people in the African American community as there are in the white community. And we need to get over that. We need to realize that we're all human. And this will cause us to fall like Rome did if we don't come together. So when the future comes, I want my grandkids and your grandkids to know how this country was built and take credit for it. And today, because of the Emancipation Proclamation, people of color are able to get a good education. And with education, you can go forward because you have to listen to the young people. When they come to the museum, I want to hear what they say. I don't want to do all the talking. They can come up with some things you just cannot believe. And then we have to take that and harmonize with it and listen to them and say, yeah, that's possible. So my desire is for the museum to have someone to be able to do what I'm doing, because they're going to have to get paid for what I do. So we need to build an endowment. But it is a repository. It is a repository of historical significance for the future. And so the thousands of items that I have on display are for people to ask questions. Now, if you know the answer, that's good. But when you disseminate this information to your audience after you've learned from what we share, Don't put any yeast in your stories. Tell the truth so that when you go to bed at night you can sleep. Don't be like some politicians. I'm going to go back to the word Amistad, Senku, being captured by those Spanish. Be free. And I'm going to share something with the locals here that they may not be expecting. See, there's a group of people called our kind of people. A lot of these people don't know that some of them, because of the texture of their skin, they hold themselves higher than other people. And the young word today is bougie. You hear a lot of people dressed up in Gucci shoes and J-Car shirts. They're bougie. They're classic. Well, the correct term is Beaujolais. And Beaujolais means to be a part of that culture, you cannot be darker than a brown paper bag. And when you share that and tell the truth to be free, you're open for those birds that travel the skies to tell our people it's time to go. And then you realize that when you look at someone who has kinky hair, or you look at someone who has straight hair, they're equal. There's no such thing as bad hair. There's no such thing as good hair. Ask bougies. They do it all. And so I want people to know that if you can commit yourself to being truthful to your past, you will build a better future. How far have we come from slavery to a president of the United States who was lighter than a brown paper bag, to a president today who says he's going to be for all people. Now you put that in your gift bag and you pull out the winner. So for the future, when I finish this presentation, I'm going to stand like the birds that flew to the east following the North Star. And when those birds came down to land, if you enjoyed my presentation today, you will give me an applause. Otherwise, you never want to see me again.